15 years of ignored pain, dozens of tests, and then I found a small, injured creature under the willow tree that changed everything. I woke up most mornings with a weight across my chest and a joint in my left hip that seemed fused to time. The pain had a pattern, like a clock that measured loss in minutes. It began as a dull ache and slowly became the soundtrack of my days. I was 38 when the diagnosis landed as if from a distant office, a label that felt more like a sentence than a name. Doctors used words like progressive and incurable. They wrote scripts, scheduled scans, and offered sterile sympathy. They did not say how to stop the nights from tightening into fear, or how to unlearn the way my hands clenched around invisible threats. I did not expect to be saved by anything that did not have a pulse or a language, and yet that is what happened. If you want to follow every step of this unlikely rescue and the exact practice that released what medicine could not reach, subscribe and turn on notifications now. There is a guide in the first pinned comment for anyone who wants to begin gently exploring their own roots of pain. I was Jonah then, and I still carry the memory of the hospital corridors like a worn map on the inside of my skull. The backstory is long and stubborn, and it matters because the body remembers things the mind files away. I grew up in a small coastal town where salt stuck to my skin, and the horizon was a promise that rarely broke. My mother worked nights and taught me how to boil potatoes until they laughed at the edge. My father left when I was 9, and the house learned silence in the manner of an animal learning to be still to avoid a predator. By 25, I had a career writing grant proposals. By 32, I had a daughter named Sarah who smelled like orange peel and pocket change. The first clear memory of the pain was not physical at all. It was the day my ex-wife Elise closed the door without explanation, and that slam folded something inside me into a place where sorrow ossified into a constant ache. I learned to speak in terms of logic and efficiency because feelings were unpredictable and expensive. I learned to tuck corners of grief into neat envelopes and stack them in a drawer labeled "Not Now." The drawer closed, and the body kept the receipt. At 38, the pain was both intimate and political. It dictated whether I could attend Sarah's parent-teacher nights, whether I could stand in the kitchen long enough to make pancakes, whether I could laugh without feeling a tremor of fear that the laughter might be a trigger. I described it to doctors as a burning, then a tightening, then a numbness that moved. From my jaw down through my shoulders to my left hip. They measured inflammation markers, ordered MRIs, and pronounced degenerative changes. I took medications that numbed but did not restore. I tried physiotherapy with a patient named Mark who believed in the science of micro-movements and in the honest sweat of rehabilitation. I tried acupuncture with a woman called Nurse Hannah who had a gentle laugh and a way of listening that felt like light. I tried meditation classes at a community center where Professor Lane taught breathing as if it were a manual skill. Nothing removed the center of grief lodged behind my ribs. Each failed treatment was a small death of hope and a new layer of explanation. Structural, autoimmune, neuropathic. The verdict from Dr. Patel at the pain clinic was calm and precise. He said we could manage symptoms, but the underlying process seemed resistant to current interventions. He said, "I am sorry," and handed me another referral. I sought alternatives. I went to a specialist in psychotraumatology named Dr. Morales, who explained mind-body connections with a clinician's vocabulary. She did not promise miracles. She asked me to map memories on paper and to notice where they sat in my body. In one session, she guided me through a memory of Elise walking away, and I noticed a heat in my chest like a cold that refused to be buried. Her language opened a door, and for the first time in a long while, I lay on a couch and allowed the story to be less tidy. I tried a small community of people who practiced somatic experiencing. I traveled to see an osteopath who said that sometimes the body kept the record of being abandoned in the alignment of the pelvis. My bank account thinned and my sense of self withered. Friends offered kindness and practical help. Sarah visited when she could and tried to be both child and adult caregiver.
My brother David sent emails with lists of specialists and flights booked and canceled depending on my pain levels. Each person was a thread in a fabric that frayed and was mended and frayed again. The medical journey was full of interventions that seemed sensible on paper and often felt hollow in my bones. I underwent a diagnostic arthroscopy in my hip that found mild cartilage wear, but nothing categorical enough to explain what I felt. I was offered a steroid injection by Dr. Patel, which dulled the pain for a few weeks, and then the ache returned with a new underlying nerve buzz. I tried a trial of biologic medication recommended by an immunologist named Dr. Sanchez, who spoke in the quiet language of clinical trials and side effect profiles. The drug required regular blood work and a strict schedule. It made me dizzy and gave me a rash, but the deep burning remained. I tried hyperbaric oxygen treatment because an alternative clinic in a neighboring city made a claim about cellular regeneration.
Regeneration. The chamber hissed like a breathing whale and my ears popped, and I left feeling oddly hopeful but with no long-term improvement. I read studies that linked unresolved trauma to immune dysregulation, and then read counter-arguments that cautioned against simplistic causation. Each specialist I met brought a frame, but none offered a vantage point from which the sum of my suffering became visible and mutable. I tried to be pragmatic. I learned to schedule my life around good hours, to arrange Sarah's school pickup on days when my hip allowed it, to accept help from Mark and Nurse Hannah with a gratitude that felt like an apology. My social life narrowed to precise interactions where I could measure how long it would take to stand, to sit, to leave. The insomnia grew alongside the pain, because fear and pain are poor bedfellows. I remember sitting in a car at 3 in the morning, listening to the ocean because the noise made my head less loud. The medicine had done what it could. The rest of the work felt like archaeology, like looking for a shard of pottery in a field of broken possibilities. Then, the night under the willow, everything shifted. I went out that evening to clear my head. The air smelled of wet earth and cut grass, and something metallic like a coin left in the rain. There was a thin mist on the ground that caught the light from the lampposts and ribbons. I walked with a cane I had begun to rely on, and with a coat that smelled of old coffee. The path wound through a small park behind my building, where a willow tree leaned as if to listen. I heard a sound like paper folding, and then a rustle that was too deliberate for a night animal. My cane thudded on a hollow place, and then struck a small figure huddled in a nest of roots. It was the size of a large cat, with skin that drank light and turned it to an inner glow. Its eyes were too reflective, not like an animal's eyes, but like polished glass holding different worlds. It had a gash on one leg that leaked a thin, ink-colored fluid. It breathed in small, rapid pulls, the kind of breath that sounds like someone counting to steady themselves. I did not know what to do. The rational part of my brain cataloged improbabilities, and the other part simply knelt. The scene was hypersensory. I could feel the damp of the ground through my trousers, the cool press of night air against my face, the smell of the willow resin like a balm. My hands trembled as I reached out, and when I touched the creature, its skin was cool and slightly damp, and it did not recoil. It made a sound that was not vocal so much as a ripple, and then a presence filled the space between us as if someone had opened a window and a thought had drifted in. I expected fear. I expected a fight. I found instead a curiosity that felt like sunlight. The creature turned its head, and in a voice that was not heard but understood, I felt the meaning. Thank you. The rescue was clumsy and intimate. I wrapped my jacket around the injured limb the way someone would wrap a wounded child. I felt the creature's tiny heartbeat against my palm, a rhythmic pulsing that had a cadence almost like a metronome. I made the decision to take it to my apartment because my car was mossy and the nearest clinic would be locked at that hour. Sarah was asleep at her mother's that night, Elisa's absence like a constant low tide. I carried the creature and it nestled into my arms like an old book finding a lap.
The journey home was a montage of ordinary textures amplified by the strangeness of what I held. The elevator smelled like bleach, the carpet like dust. The hallway light hummed in a way that matched the creature's internal glow. Inside my kitchen, the creature sat on the counter, and I set up a box with towels and a low lamp. I named it Ori because of the golden sheen in one of its eyes. Ori watched me with an attention that felt like being seen by someone who already knew my story. That night we had a conversation that was not spoken. It began with small images like photographs being slid across a table. I thought of my father leaving, and I saw in my mind a corridor with a slamming door and the way the wallpaper buckled. I thought of Elise, and I felt a memory of the last meal we shared where words were thin as paper. The animal inside my chest that had been fed grief for years stirred, and Ori pointed without pointing to the place where the hurt had been locked. Our first verbal exchange was simple and cautious, and then it deepened. The format of our dialogue unfolded as if we were circling a lake and dropping stones into the water to see the ripples. I asked it what it was, and it replied with a taste of cold air, and a concept that landed as a clear word in my mind: healing. I asked how it spoke, and it showed me images of a ship that had become a misfit on our Earth, and of a crew that sent it small gestures of help. I asked if it understood human bodies, and it brought a memory of a healer on its world who had touched and listened. I asked if it could help me, and it made a sound that was almost laughter, and then a slow, emphatic image of a chain unclasping. We developed ritual language. I learned Ori's name in the same breath as I learned to slow down. The first time the sound vibrated my inner ear, and a warmth traveled down my spine. It did not remove the pain at once. Instead, it offered a lens. It showed me how memory had made a scaffold and how my immune system had interpreted the scaffold as a blueprint to be maintained at all costs. It presented images of a childhood door and the way the lock had turned, and explained the painstaking way tissues adapt to emotion. It was clinical and tender at once. It was as if the creature held a map of biochemistry and of myth both. At this moment, I want to pause and speak to you directly. If you have lived with pain that no one seems to understand, I know the exhaustion of trying everything and still waking with that same weight. Please write in the comments what treatment failed you the most. Start your comment with "I tried" so that others can find the patterns and feel less alone. Or, if you prefer, share one word that describes how you feel about your pain today. Each comment helps someone else find resonance and helps us decide which stories to investigate next. Your words matter. They create a community of people who are listening and learning. Thank you for sharing. Now come back, because the next moment is the one that changed my life and might change yours too. The first contact scene that followed was dense and intimate, and it became the core of the story. Ori taught me a simple method to listen to the body as if it were a room with objects placed by memory. It asked me to lie down and guided my attention to the hip with a light that I could see when I closed my eyes. I felt colors and textures, an internal landscape of grit and glass lodged into soft tissue. The creature explained that on its world, healing was often a matter of narrative. A wound that repeated is a wound that has a story insisting on being retold. Ori asked me to tell the story of Elise, and as I did, the image of the final dinner unfolded with sensory detail. I could see the candle smoke, taste the burned toast, hear the clink of cutlery, and the silence that followed. As I narrated the details, I noticed the pain change from a constant background hum to a shape that had edges and corners. It was no longer amorphous suffering. It was a scene with actors. The revelation came in the form of a metaphor and then a concrete understanding. Ori showed me an image of a small stone lodged under the skin of a sculpture, which over years had become calcified into the surface. The stone was the memory of betrayal, and it had collaborated with my immune response to create a protective casing. The immune system, seeking to protect, had built tissue around the emotional injury, and in doing so had
created chronic inflammation and altered nerve signaling. The creature used images of filamentous light and of knitting needles to explain the process. It made me see that forgiveness was not an erasure, but a reorganization, and that the tissue could reorganize if the internal story changed. This revelation was followed by practice, and it required me to do things that felt absurd and courageous at once. Ori guided me through a series of steps that mixed body awareness, ritualized statement, and physical gesture. It asked me to imagine speaking to Elise as if she were a separate person, and to say out loud sentences that named my pain, gave it a name, and then offered release. The first few times my voice cracked, and a small sound that was half laugh and half cry escaped me. Ori kept time like a patient conductor. It prompted me to breathe into specific areas and to visualize tissue loosening like reeds in a river. It taught me to use touch as a language. I pressed my palm to my hip and felt warmth rise and then recede. The technique combined something like psychotherapy with something like manual therapy. It was not purely spiritual, and it was not purely mechanical. It asked for both sight and material action. There were several moments of acute tension that read like near collapses and then recoveries. In the first moment, I lay on the floor and confronted the night of the door slamming. As I described the scene, my throat closed, tears came, and the pain flared into a sharp blade. I remembered a winter wind and the smell of washing powder and Elise saying, "You are being dramatic." The pain synchronized with the memory, and for a few seconds I believed I would faint. The world narrowed to the sound of my own breathing and the clock in the hallway. Then Ori shifted its glow and sent an image of another life for me, soft and possible, and my breath returned. In the second moment, I allowed myself to hold anger rather than translate it into guilt. The anger roared up, and my muscles tensed so hard my hip felt like it would shatter. I could hear Mark's voice saying, "Remember to pace," and Nurse Hannah's hands guiding me to release. The tension was a furnace, and I learned to sit in its heat without trying to extinguish it. In the third moment, I attempted a ritual that included writing a letter to Elise and then tearing it up and burning it in a bowl. The fire smelled like paper and ash, and I felt guilty and liberated at the same time, and the pain shifted its center a degree lower. Each moment of tension lasted like a held breath and then eased. Dialogues in these sessions were frequent and layered. Here is a selection of exchanges from one of the deepest nights. "Jonah, what do you see?" Ori asked. "I see the door and the candle and the toast," I answered. "What does the door do?" Ori asked. "It leaves," I said. "Why? Because of leaving?" Ori inquired. "Because it left me," I said. "What does leaving ask you to do?" Ori wondered. "To hold the space," I said. "What would holding look like?" Ori asked. "It would be saying I was hurt and not disappearing," I answered. "Say it now," Ori invited. I said out loud, "Elise, you left and I was hurt, and I felt like a child." The voice in my head softened, and the room felt wider. "Are you angry, Jonah?" Ori asked. "Yes," I said. "Then let the anger be a tool, not a prison," Ori said. The sound of the creature was like wind through reeds, and sometimes like a bell. I wept, and the creature hummed, and we moved through the night like two healers passing instruments. The process of forgiveness was methodical and messy, and it required steps that felt both practical and sacred. First, I admitted to myself the exact events I had hidden. I wrote them down with detail and then read them aloud. The second step was to identify the physical location of each memory and to place a palm there and breathe. The third step was to make a small reparative act, a gesture that could be symbolic like leaving a letter in a river or practical like setting a boundary in a strained relationship. The fourth step was to use touch and movement to remap the tissues. Ari taught me to place warmth on the hip and to imagine threads of grief loosening like knotted yarn. The fifth step was to enlist witnesses. I asked Sarah and my brother David to attend part of a ritual where I spoke about the past and they listened without offering solutions. The presence of other humans mattered because their attention helped my nervous system recalibrate to safety. On the physical plane, the change was subtle at first and then sudden. After a week of nightly work with Ari, the constant burning dulled. I woke one morning and the hip that had dictated my mobility for years allowed me to stand for 15 minutes without a band of nausea under the sternum. The sensation was a different quality of space. It was as though the hinge of a door had been oiled and the movement cost less. Ari explained that healing on its world often required an exchange. It had been saved by me, and in return offered a method learned over centuries by beings who listened to tissue memory. The extraction of the calcified emotional stone was not theatrical. It looked to me like a slow unspooling of a cord, and I felt a coolness travel through the joint and then a warmth of blood like newly opened pathways. We documented the change as best we could. I returned to Dr. Patel and showed him my daily logs. He obliged with scheduled imaging and an MRI that his technician, a woman called Rosa, was patient enough to explain in ordinary language. The pre- and post scans looked like two versions of the same landscape. In the initial image, there was an area of increased signal and irregularity. In the follow-up, the signal was normalized and there was less swelling. The radiologist read the scans and said the changes were noteworthy and suggested continued monitoring. I brought in Dr. Sanchez and Dr. Morales and even Professor Lane. Some scientists were incredulous and asked for controlled conditions and blinded studies. Others were curious and asked about the method step by step. I invited a small panel discussion at a community center where Nurse Hannah and Mark and David sat in the audience. Some members of the press called it an anecdote and then wrote stories that called it a miracle. I am careful with the word miracle because it feels like a celebrity and not like a process. Yet the objective data and the subjective relief aligned enough to force a re-examination of simple binaries. The medical community could not offer an explanation that fit the whole of the data, but they took the scans and took notes. When skeptics visited our apartment, I invited them to listen and to leave any preconceived notions at the door. Elise did not return to witness the ritual. She declined to be part of the healing, and perhaps she had her own map to walk. Sarah visited 3 times during the weeks after the extraction, and her presence was both a validation and a reminder of what had been lived and what had been lost. David kept a log and produced a spreadsheet and jokes to lighten moments of dread. Mark re-engaged me in physiotherapy with a renewed plan that acknowledged the changes and built on them carefully. Rosa, the technician, offered to run the imaging protocols again at 3 and 6 months without charge. Dr. Morales began to draft an article that sought to bridge mechanisms of stress-related immune change with manual and narrative interventions. Professor Lane proposed a pilot study. The academic language arrived like rain after a drought and felt both necessary and incomplete. There were continued tensions even after the initial shift in my body. One night I woke with a return of old panic and the hip tightened with old rhythms. I called Ori and the creature reminded me that healing is not a linear arc but a braided river. We returned to the ritual and I allowed myself to rediscover anger and to let sorrow pass through without sheltering it. The second setback came when a journalist published a piece that sensationalized the creature and led to curiosity seekers showing up near the willow. My privacy felt violated and the stress threatened the progress. I engaged the community through public statements to ask for respect and space, and many responded with kindness. The third tension was internal. I found that the label of miraculous healed person made me feel other and sometimes lonelier. I had to learn to reestablish my identity as Jonah the writer, Jonah the father, not merely Jonah the healed. The epilogue is best told in 3 moments, because healing is not only a before and after, but a series of months where small lives unfold inside larger ones. At 1 month, the changes were pragmatic and felt like small surprises. I woke and realized I could play on the floor with Sarah without counting minutes. I walked to the park for the first time in years and felt the soles of my feet remember routes like old friends. The sensation in my hip was not absent, but it was a resident that no longer ruled the house. I returned to my office and wrote proposals without needing to pause for breath that tasted like panic. Friends noticed my posture and joked that I seemed taller. I felt cautious optimism and gratitude like a pocket I kept checking. At 3 months, the changes had a rhythmic quality. The scan showed reduced inflammation, and I had fewer nights where insomnia took complete custody of my sleep. I participated in a workshop led by Dr. Morales where we practiced narrative techniques to map memory onto movement. I spoke openly about Ori and about the mechanics of the ritual, and people asked practical questions. Some tried versions of it with measurable relief. The pilot study that Professor Lane proposed found enough clinical interest for a small grant application. Community members who had been reading my logs came forward with their stories. A support group formed where people shared not to seek miracles, but to exchange techniques and to document changes. My relationship with my body softened into a negotiated friendship. At 6 months, the landscape shifted again in ways that lived beyond physical measures. My metabolism normalized, and the ongoing low-grade inflammation markers in my blood moved toward a healthier range. My social life expanded because I could commit to dinners and theater nights and to being present without calculating the cost of movement. The more subtle change was in how I engaged with memory. I no longer told the stories that kept me trapped in a loop. I told different stories. I could name pain and then describe the action I would take to honor it and move. My daughter Sarah and I planned a small trip to the coast to show her the horizon I had once believed was a promise. We walked a beach where the wind tightened our coats and the salt dried on our skin. I held her hand and felt the kind of unstrained joy that is not performative but simply present. The ripple effects included small acts of giving back. I helped found a community clinic where people could learn body-based narrative techniques alongside physiotherapy. Nurse Hannah took a lead role and Professor Lane offered training. Dr. Morales supervised a group program and Dr. Sanchez provided oversight for safe medical monitoring. We kept rigorous records so the work could be evaluated with integrity. The creature Ori did not become a public spectacle. It remained a private presence and sometimes visited other places where beings had learned to listen. I learned to be careful with language and to be willing to have both scientific curiosity and spiritual openness in the same sentence. If this story touches something in you, if you carry an ache that medicine has named but not solved, know that there are paths that do not reject science and do not demand surrender to mysticism. The method that helped me combined precise body awareness, narrative confrontation, ritual gesture, and follow-up with medical imaging. It required witnesses and it asked for patience. I am not saying this will work for everyone, nor that I have all the answers. I am saying that the body keeps records and that sometimes the key to changing the record is to change the story. Thank you for listening to how I saved a stranded creature and how in return it offered a way to reconfigure a body that had been living under the weight of unresolved grief. If this narrative resonated, share your experience in the comments and begin your own sentence with, "I tried," so others can find solidarity. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that combine careful evidence with lived practice. If you want the step-by-step guide I used, the link is in the pinned comment and includes precautions and recommended medical oversight. My final thought is simple and persistent. Your body was never your enemy. It has been a messenger and a guardian using the only language it had available. When you learn to listen and to respond with compassion and method, the work of repair can begin to feel possible.